UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon revoked the invitation to Iran to the Syria conference. What is Russia's attitude towards it? How can it impact the efficiency of the meeting in general, which was devised in such a complex manner? Well, you know, of course it is a mistake, and I've mentioned it on many occasions, but it won't be a catastrophe. Anyways, it is a one-day event which will take place on the 22nd January, tomorrow, with the participation of around 40 foreign ministers of various states, including the remote regions such as Latin America, East Asia. And of course, despite the ceremonial nature of this event, the fact that Iran is not present in the list of 40 states cannot but raise questions. Take into account the results of our joint work with Iran, and John Kerry, as many others, recognized publicly that Iran is to play an important role in finding mutually acceptable ways to settle this Syrian crisis. We have always been calling for the fact, and it's also the basis of the Russian initiative, for the fact that all the foreign stakeholders that could have an impact on the situation on the ground should participate at the initial stage of this conference. Well, generally speaking, it is our common cause to involve Iran to this process in the same way as many other countries of the region. All the countries are invited, whereas it turns out that the invitation to Iran has been withdrawn. Well, you know about the response of the opposition to the Ban Ki-moon's announcement that he's going to invite Iran. National Coalition put forth an ultimatum. Either the invitation is withdrawn, or in 6 hours they'll announce that they will not participate in the conference, and meaning that the situation is not very healthy. But let me remind you that the structures created by foreign stakeholders and sponsors consist of dozens of immigrants. I met most of them, and most of them represent personalities interested in bringing peace to the country, as we hope. That is why comprehensive settlement is needed. But let me remind you that the national coalition, from the very beginning, was guided by the principle of ousting the current regime, and its external sponsors were encouraging it. The principle of the regime overthrowing is not at the basis of the Russian-American initiative. According to our initiative, the conference should be convened in order to initiate a direct dialogue between the Syrian sides, in order to fully implement the Geneva Communique of the 30th of June 2012. That's it. There is no attempt to foresee the results of the Geneva Communique implementation. It only states that all the issues should be addressed by the Syrians themselves based on the general mutual accord between the government and the opposition. Many countries, as I mentioned, were conniving and were encouraging the national coalition in order to put forth preliminary conditions, including the ousting of the regime. In various statements by the so-called Group of Friends of Syria, which was protecting this coalition, including the recent statement adopted in December, it is directly put forth that the ousting of the regime is the primary goal of all the efforts that are being undertaken.
So when the Secretary General said that he was forced to withdraw the invitation to Iran because Iran does not share the principles of settlement envisaged in the Geneva Communique, this was, as I believe, it's a very sly phrase, because the Geneva Communique states what I has just said. There should be a general consent between the opposition and the government, and it was those who insist that the Geneva Communique and its implementation should lead to the regime change. It was them who insisted on the withdrawal of invitation, but this is not good faith interpretation of the Geneva Communique of 2012. So it results that those who engaged in the ill-faith interpretations are now represented at large in the Geneva conference, while Iran, who doesn't want the regime to be changed, who is quite frank about that, you know its position, I will not comment it right away, because we are talking about the invitation situation. Iran is being demanded to consent to the preconditions imposed by the opposition with the support of the whole range of supporters. This is not very graceful as I see it. You see, if we take a criterion of the settlement principle stated in the Geneva communique, then several dozens of countries should not be invited there at all, because all of them support the regime change. This is how I see the situation. And it turns out that everything turns up-down, because we also insist on not interpret the Geneva communique in different ways. That means that we also do not satisfy the demands of those who insist on inviting Iran. This is absurd. And it is also important to put it into perspective. It is a mostly ceremonial meeting, one-day meeting. The ministers will come, will call for the Syrians to come to an agreement, probably with some nuances, and they will go away, while the Syrians will stay there. They will engage in a specific dialogue, which will not be easy. Probably it will take some rounds to complete it, but the symbolism is still very important. It's not a secret that the Syrian crisis has bared the contradictions, the discrepancies, the differences in the region that were accumulated in the region for many years, including the differences within the Islamic world. We have been constantly warning against the schism in the Islamic world. But there are those who wish to implement this schism, to split the Islamic world, and to support it. And in this context, the withdrawal of invitation to Iran will not help to support the efforts of the Islamic world in fighting terrorism. And if we are talking about who takes sides with whom, who approves the conditions, let's take the Taliban movement. Do the Taliban movement accept the resolutions of the Security Council? No, but the United Nations and the United States engaged in negotiations with them to find some solutions. We need pragmatism, and the ideological approaches, unilateral considerations will not lead to anywhere, but there is no disaster. We will come to the Geneva conference, though it will be held in Montreux, but still its name is Geneva II, and we will promote our line, we will pursue our line to start the direct dialogue without preconditions between Syrian parties. And I believe it is in our mutual interests to make the inter-Syrian dialogue an inclusive one, because the national coalition is just a part of Syrian opposition. And it was from this coalition that Syrian National Board, Syrian National Council opted out from. But besides that coalition, there are oppositionary forces that are acting inside Syria. National Coordinating Committee, National Front for Changes, Syrian Democratic Assembly, Kurd organizations, and we should engage in the thinking over how to make this dialogue be in line with those criteria that are approved by the UN Security Council, who has called for ensure the participations of the entire range of the Syrian society in this dialogue. This is what we should strive to. And speaking about principles, the sponsors of the national coalitions at its outset recognize it the only representative of the Syrian people? And how does it go in line with the Geneva communique, which states that the future of the Syria should be determined by the government and opposition, basing on their consent and agreement? And while the coalition is recognized as a representative of the Syrian people, then it means that those who recognize it do not recognize the Geneva communique. So I very lament that.